Iran's currency lost half its value in months. Russia became the world's most sanctioned nation in just 10 days. North Korea's middle class vanished. What connects these three countries? Economic sanctions. The invisible weapon that reshapes entire nations without firing a single shot. But here's the twist. While sanctions devastate ordinary people, they're making governments stronger, not weaker. Welcome to the paradox that's rewriting global power. Let's start with a number that will shock you. 17 percentage points. That's how much Iran's middle class shrank annually from 2012 to 2019 because of sanctions. Think about that. Nearly 1/5 of Iran's middle class disappeared every single year. We're talking about educated professionals, teachers, engineers, doctors, people who once formed the backbone of Iran's economy, suddenly unable to afford basic necessities. And it gets worse. Today, in 2025, Iran faces what economists call a perfect storm. The Iranian rial has crashed to a record low of 1 million rials to the dollar. Let that sink in. 1 million. The minimum wage, which was worth $180 in March of 2025, plummeted to under $130 by September. And prices? They've gone absolutely insane. Pinto beans tripled in price within a year. Butter nearly doubled. Rice, the staple food, jumped over 80%. But here's where it gets really interesting. These sanctions were designed to pressure the Iranian government to change its nuclear policies. Instead, something unexpected happened. While ordinary Iranians struggled to buy bread, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, actually got stronger. The sanctions created a shadow economy, and guess who controls it? The military and government-connected organizations called bonyads. They profit from smuggling, black markets, and controlling resources while everyone else suffers. Research shows that sanctions weakened independent economic actors while strengthening state-linked and security sector players like the IRGC. It's the exact opposite of what was intended. The people who were supposed to drive reform, the middle class, are being crushed. Meanwhile, the hardliners who benefit from isolation are thriving. Now let's talk about Russia. In February 2022, something unprecedented happened. Russia invaded Ukraine, and within 10 days, Western allies unleashed the mother of all sanction packages. Russia became the target of 2,778 new sanctions designations in just those 10 days, bringing the total to more than 5,530, surpassing Iran, which took a decade to accumulate 3,616 sanctions. Russia instantly became the world's most sanctioned nation. While the West froze Russian assets worth hundreds of billions of dollars, they cut off major Russian banks from SWIFT, the global payment system, they banned technology exports, they implemented an oil price cap. The expectation? Russia's economy would collapse within months. But reality had other plans. Russia's GDP actually grew by approximately 3.6% in 2023. Following only a 1.2% contraction in 2022. How is this possible? Russia transformed itself into a war economy. Military spending doubled from 3 to 4% of GDP before the invasion to over 6% by 2025. This massive government spending artificially propped up the economy. Salaries started growing steadily in 2023, with double-digit inflation-adjusted growth just over a year into the war. In 2024, real salaries went up 8.7% compared to 2023. Russians were earning more money even as their country faced the most comprehensive sanctions in history. But don't be fooled. The facade is cracking. By late 2024, the Russian ruble lost more than half its value against the dollar and euro. Russian oil exports dropped to $64.40 per barrel at the end of 2024. Down from $70 initially, meaning the Russian government is generating less revenue from oil sales. Inflation is skyrocketing. Even Vladimir Putin admitted in his December 2024 televised address that the economy is overheating and inflation is a problem. Russia's central bank raised interest rates to 21% as of February 2025 to counteract inflation, the highest level in decades. 21%. For comparison, most healthy economies have interest rates between 2 and 5%. This means borrowing money in Russia has become crushingly expensive, and corporate bankruptcies are looming. But here's the kicker about Russia's situation. They've become a master of sanctions evasion. India became the second largest provider of restricted technology to Russia and a primary transshipment hub for highly advanced United States trademarked chips. Russia rerouted its oil exports to China and India, who happily bought at discounted prices. They developed workarounds for every sanction thrown at them. Now, North Korea. This is where sanctions have been in place the longest, and the effects are both devastating and instructive. Since 2006, following its first nuclear test, North Korea has faced nearly a dozen United Nations sanctions resolutions, plus extensive unilateral United States sanctions. These aren't targeted sanctions. They're comprehensive, designed to isolate the country completely. Research using novel data sets found that United Nations sanctions reduced North Korea's manufacturing output by 12.9% and real income by 15.3%. The country's exports and imports exposed to United Nations sanctions rose from 0% to almost 60% by the end of 2017. It was meant to be maximum pressure. But North Korea did something remarkable. They didn't collapse. They adapted. Sanctions became a powerful incentive for North Korea to activate its import substitution policy, with leadership emphasizing achieving economic and energy independence. Unable to import, they started producing domestically. Unable to trade legally, they perfected smuggling networks. Unable to access global markets, they found willing partners, primarily China, but increasingly Russia. And here's the cruel irony. According to a 2018 UNICEF report, 200,000 North Korean children suffer from acute malnutrition, and sanctions put 60,000 of these vulnerable children at risk of starvation due to disruption in humanitarian aid. The sanctions hurt the people they're supposed to protect, while the Kim regime remains firmly in power, using isolation as justification for its authoritarian control. Here's something most people don't realize about the scale of modern sanctions. In 2024 alone, the United States added 3,135 persons to its specially designated nationals list, a notable increase from 2,502 in 2023. That's over 3,000 individuals and entities cut off from the global financial system in a single year. The sanctions machine is operating at unprecedented speed and scale, and it's not just America. The United States issued more sanctions in 2024 than all major sanctions-issuing jurisdictions combined. This concentration of sanctioning power in one country raises serious questions about the future of global trade and finance. But here's what makes sanctions particularly complex in today's interconnected world. They don't exist in isolation. Research reveals something fascinating about how Russia has adapted. Russia's trade with China, India, and Turkey increased beyond standard trade diversion effects, with direct bilateral trade costs between Russia and these countries actually decreasing. In other words, sanctions didn't just redirect trade. They actively strengthened Russia's economic ties with non-sanctioning countries. The implications are staggering. When you sanction one country, you might actually be improving its welfare through gains from trade with your competitors. The research suggests that Russian sanctions may have even benefited Russia's overall welfare due to these new trading relationships. It's the ultimate unintended consequence. And the success rate? Analysis of over 200 sanctions imposed between World War I and the early 2000s suggests that sanctions made at least a modest contribution to a goal that was partly realized only 34% of the time. 1/3 success rate. Yet sanctions usage has increased ninefold between 2000 and 2021. What's driving this surge despite mediocre results? Political convenience. Sanctions look tough, they're cheaper than military action, and they satisfy domestic audiences demanding action. But the question nobody wants to ask is this: are we creating more problems than we're solving? Consider this reality check. Russia received 1,706 SDN designations in 2024, while China received 276, and Iran received 130. Yet all three countries continue their objectionable activities. Russia's still in Ukraine. Iran's nuclear program continues advancing. North Korea keeps testing missiles. The sanctions haven't stopped them. What sanctions have done is create a parallel economic universe, an authoritarian trading bloc where sanctioned nations help each other survive and even thrive, where alternative payment systems bypass the dollar, where smuggling networks operate with military precision, where the cost of doing business illegally becomes just another line item in the budget. Let's zoom out and look at the bigger picture. What these three countries teach us is that economic sanctions work differently than intended. They do cause economic pain, real, devastating pain. Studies show sanctions have had a statistically significant impact on target countries by reducing their GDP growth, with negative effects lasting for over a decade. But changing behavior? That's another story. Academic literature consensus shows that conventional trade and financial sanctions result in meaningful behavioral change in targeted countries about 40% of the time. 40%. That's basically a coin flip. Why don't they work better? Three key reasons. First, sanctions create a rally around the flag effect. When a nation faces external economic pressure, citizens often unite behind their government, even if they disagree with its policies. The government can blame all economic problems on foreign enemies rather than its own failures. Second, sanctions create opportunities for corruption and black markets. When legal trade is blocked, illegal trade thrives. And who controls illegal trade? Usually the very government officials and military forces the sanctions are meant to pressure. Third, sanctioned countries find each other. Iran, Russia, and North Korea have formed what analysts call an authoritarian value chain. Recent reports suggest Russia has purchased infantry rockets and missiles from North Korea, while the Russian military launched waves of Iranian-made unmanned aerial vehicles in attacks on Ukraine. They trade technology, weapons, and resources, helping each other circumvent sanctions. U.S. pressure, the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine, and the Mideast crisis aligned Pyongyang and Tehran, not only with each other, but also with Russia and China. The sanctions that were meant to isolate these countries are actually pushing them together, creating a powerful anti-Western bloc. And China? China is the elephant in the room. All three sanctioned nations rely heavily on Chinese trade and financial networks. China buys Iranian oil, provides technology to Russia, and serves as North Korea's lifeline. India is now the second largest provider of restricted technology to Russia, showing that even democracies will choose economic interests over sanctions enforcement when the price is right. So here's the uncomfortable truth. Sanctions are a blunt instrument with sharp consequences. They devastate middle classes who might otherwise push for reform. They strengthen authoritarian governments who control the black market. They push sanctioned nations into deeper alliances with each other. And they often fail to achieve their stated policy goals, but they remain the tool of choice because the alternatives are worse. Military intervention costs lives. Doing nothing sends a message that bad behavior has no consequences. Sanctions sit in the middle, harsh enough to signal disapproval, but not so harsh as to trigger war. The question isn't whether sanctions work. The question is, what are we willing to accept as the cost? Because in Iran, Russia, and North Korea, we're seeing that cost play out in real time. Middle classes disappearing, children going hungry, currencies collapsing, economies warping. All while the targeted governments dig in deeper, finding new ways to survive and even thrive under pressure. These three nations show us that sanctions are transformative. They reshape entire countries, but not always in the ways we expect or intend. They are creating a world where isolated nations band together, where shadow economies flourish, where suffering falls on the innocent, and where strongmen use external pressure as justification for internal control. The invisible weapon of economic sanctions is powerful, yes, but it is also unpredictable, often counterproductive, and raises serious questions about whether the pain inflicted is worth the limited change achieved. As the world becomes more interconnected yet more divided, As new alliances form among sanctioned states, we are witnessing an unintended consequence of economic warfare, the creation of a parallel global order, one built by those locked out of the mainstream. That is the paradox of sanctions. They are meant to bring nations in line. Instead, they are pushing them together into something new, something the architects of sanctions never anticipated. And that might be the most important lesson these three countries are teaching the world right now.